We're going to continue some of the discussions we had earlier today, talking about the nature of God. I want to start off this evening by going back to something that we talked about, at least in small detail, earlier today. I mentioned that the largest percentage of people today who abandon their faith in God typically do it not purely for logical reasons. They haven't sat down and said, I love God, I'm committed to Him, I believe the Bible, and I do all these things, but I had this chemistry class and they told me this and I worked through it and it just no longer, I'm not sure that this really makes sense to me anymore. I'm not saying that never happens. And I'm not saying that people don't have those thoughts in their mind and ultimately maybe those are part of the influencing factors. But ultimately, when you drill down and find out what's going on, it typically has nothing to do with a logical decision. Generally speaking, what we're talking about is someone who has an underlying ethical issue that they've been wrestling with in some way. Some pain that has been inflicted in them, something that they can no longer justify or rationalize a desire to believe. And maybe that clashes with our modern thinking on sexual ethics and the LGBT question and things of that nature. Maybe it's a negative experience with a member that they've had, that someone treated them in a certain way or acted in a certain way that was not in line with the teachings of the Lord's church. Maybe it's a negative impression of the mission of the church. It's become too much about money and politics, and that's just not something I'm interested in. Or maybe there's a perception of a lack of love. These people are just not loving people, and they're not doing for me what I believe that they should do. The biggest problem of all of that, I think, seems to come down to this question. Is God good? Richard Dawkins, I quoted from him earlier today. This is a statement he makes to the God delusion. He says, "The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous, proud of it, petty, unjust, unforgiving, control-freak, vindictive, bloodthirsty, ethnic cleanser, a misogynist, homophobic, racist, infantile, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully." I heard one preacher say, I feel like he just got a thesaurus and just started listing them until he ran out of words at this point. That's the idea that we often look at. And sometimes that can be a difficult thing for us to rationalize as we read some of these stories in the Bible. And it's at this point that I think we have to recognize as well that if the atheist argument is true and that there is no God, that means there's no objective standard for any of these things. Morality is whatever we make it. Whatever culture decides that it is. There's really no question in terms of how I even define why any of the things that Richard Dawkins lists here are wrong at all. Why is it a problem for me to be any of these big words, any of these things that I am? Ultimately, what happens is that morality is decided by whoever holds power in that civilization. They get to make that decision on what it is. And I always wonder, I notice that if you notice how, especially younger people in our culture today, have become more and more involved in political issues and things of that nature, and if it seems like our culture is becoming more politicized, I would suggest to you that one of the big reasons for that is that's really the only true source of power if I'm somebody who doesn't believe in God. And if I have something that I hold in my mind and my heart to be immoral and wrong, I don't really have any basis of telling you that you're wrong and that I'm right. But what I can do is legislate you out of existence. I can make sure that the laws are written to where my version of right is imposed on you. There's a great irony in this. God taught us through Scripture to turn away from the idea of might makes right. That we don't abuse people just because we can. We don't enforce our views on people. We don't pound them down and force them and compel them to do what we want them to do just because we have that ability and power. And yet that's exactly where we are when we take God out of the equation. When a godless society comes into play, it really becomes, do I have the power to enforce my version of good on you? And what happens when society decides that the standard that used to be right is now wrong? Well, now what I believe is wrong is now right. And what does that do to us? How do I even justify any of those things. And is it kind of scary to me that the things that we might believe to be immoral and horrible and despicable today, in 10 years could be absolutely the opposite? And what's changed? The answer is absolutely nothing has changed. So right away we have some problems with this question in terms of what standard we're going to look at. But the reason I think that the arguments that he makes here still hit hard for us as Christians is because that we can read parts of the Bible and when we read them out of context or when we read them without the proper framework, it's easy to see a God who seems to be violating the laws and the principles and the ethics that he has told us to follow. We sometimes struggle, I think, reconciling some of those stories. And the idea that God who's just, who's loving, who seeks our good, and yet look at some of the things that he does. If we don't have a full understanding of the Bible and an appreciation for who God is, and the fact that God is not a one-dimensional character, he's not a fictional character the way people would write him, but he is God. He is an actual person with sometimes seemingly contradictory aspects of his nature. Things that sometimes can be different. Have you ever known anybody that one day they're a really intellectual, logical person, but one day they just do something that just didn't make any sense to me? Why do you do that? Well, because he's a human being. Because he has a personality that's not just forced into this one mold that's very, very easy to understand without a context of what's going on in his mind and in his thoughts and in his life. And when we don't understand God for that purpose, if we don't see God for who he is and what he is, then it's very easy for us to accuse God falsely or unjustly or even to reject the concept of God altogether. And I would argue the majority of people who refuse to believe the God of the Bible don't do it because they have logically disproven God, but because they cannot accept the God who is described in the Bible as really being God. And typically when we think about those concerns, they really break out into three concepts. The problem of evil, first of all. How could a good God create evil and allow evil in this life? Second, problems of suffering. A loving God would never allow good people to suffer, and he certainly wouldn't cause good people to suffer. Thirdly, problems of judgment. A merciful God would not condemn anyone to an eternity of hell. And they say, because of that, I can't accept this version of God. And what they typically mean, if we're being honest about that, is not I can't, but rather I refuse to. Because ultimately, as I said, and as I'll probably continue to say, we believe what we want to believe. The reality is that I can believe what I choose to believe, but in terms of affecting the reality, in terms of the question of proving or disproving the existence of God, my feelings on God really don't make a lot of difference. How I view God. Is God fair? Is God just? Is it right for him to tell me not to do these things? Is it right for him to do these things or act in this way? Ultimately, none of that has anything to do with whether God is or is not. Sometimes we act as if it is, which is kind of odd to me. The idea that if God exists, he exists independently of me and of my opinions of him. Which means that I can't disprove God by saying, well, a good God would never do this, therefore God is not good, therefore God does not exist. A lot of people, though, who at one time believed in God, I think have drifted in that direction. And even more in the last few years, as the pressure from the world is mounted, it becomes harder and harder to maintain the faith. And I truly believe that one of the reasons that has happened is that we have more and more young people who are growing up in religious homes, even in the Lord's church. And they're not equipped to deal with these questions because we're often afraid to acknowledge them. The fact that some of the things that we read in the Old Testament are really pretty horrific on the surface. And they're difficult to understand. I heard somebody make a point one time. He said, we study doctrine in the light so that we can see in the darkness. Doctrine is not just something that we do so that we can understand and so that we can pass theology classes or that we can impose some sort of concept on others. Sometimes say, we've grown up in a culture that for centuries has said, or decades at least, look, we need to stop talking about doctrine and start talking about Jesus. And so we stop talking about doctrine. And we raise a generation of people that can't explain the simplest concepts, things that we've been talking about as Christians for thousands of years. And all of a sudden, I've got no answer to the idea of how can a loving God allow suffering to go on in this world. I can't really address those things. And I think what happens is, and at least this is my impression, is that we've lived in a culture for so long that wants to talk only about the love of God and not about the justice of God, the grace of God and not the punishment of God. That we've raised, I think, in many cases, a generation of people who are so removed from that idea that they've come to understand their relationship with God in terms of a focus on me. What God has done for me, what God will do for me, how God loves me. God is focused, and all God cares about is having a relationship with me. And we hear that, some of the language we hear in some of our praise hymns. If you heard some of especially some of the contemporary Christian music, that really is just about God just knocking down walls and running after me and grabbing me and holding me, and He won't let me go. And He's just so obsessed with me. It's all about me. And then somebody says, where was the reckless love of God for those people in Jericho when God said to slaughter all of them? Where was the reckless love of God when He condemns me to eternal punishment just because of somebody that I happen to love? Or something in my life that I just wanted to do? And there's no answer. What do I say to that? And I think it gets harder even when we have people around us in our world that seem like such good people, and they're so nice and kind, and we love them, and we see them involved in sin, and we ask, why would God condemn this person just for doing that? How could a just God condemn somebody for that? And when we don't have an answer for that, the easiest thing to say is, I need to get rid of this tension in my mind, and the way that I do that is I either turn my back on God, or I go find a group that can tell me about a God that doesn't have a problem and will allow me to continue on. Of course, what makes it even worse is rather than leaving the faith, what so often will happen is people will stay in the faith and attempt to bring others into their mind, and they'll start to poison the well, if you will, to describe the fact that, look, the God that we worshipped all these years is really not a good God at all. We need to change to a new God. We don't think about it in that way, right? But that's what we're doing. Because we somehow got this idea that if I just change how we talk about God, somehow that changes God. It makes no sense on any level, does it? And yet, for whatever reason, we seem to feel like we can do that. And I guess all that is to say that we need to be comfortable addressing these questions and being able to talk about them honestly and openly. Because these are not new questions. I think a lot of times, sometimes, if we're not careful, we have young people that will say, did you know that God caused this entire city to be destroyed? Did you know that the Old Testament condones slavery? Did you know that in the Old Testament there's a law that says that if a woman is forcibly raped by a man, that he has to marry her and she has to let him? What do we do with that? I mean, if we just read that out of context, that sounds pretty bad, doesn't it? And when we don't talk about that, we somehow assume that nobody's ever really asked that question. And the reality is that the questions of God and why God allows certain things, and why God allows evil, and why God treats sin in a certain way, I mean, this is going all the way back to the very beginning. In the fourth chapter of Genesis, when Abel asked God, how is it, God, that you accepted my brother's sacrifice and not me, not mine? Men like Job and Habakkuk, if you go back and read those passages, and the psalmist who asked, why is God allowing suffering in His people? Why does God continue to allow evil men to prosper and good men to be hurt? The Bible addresses those questions. But it doesn't always give easy answers. And sometimes I feel like I need to put a caveat on this lesson to say, look, all of this starts with the notion that I have to understand that God is who He is. Because, how would I say this? My mind's having a blank here. If I don't believe God is who He says He is, then really all I'm going to do is say, well, God, I get that you think that you have to do this, but you really don't. My way is better. And I trust God. And I have to understand that God is who He is. Because if God's not who He is, then why are we even here. But if he is who he is, then doesn't that kind of change the way I view his actions and his right to do as he sees fit? The story of Job is one of those stories that the atheist likes to go to and say, look, this is exhibit A to how bad this guy is. God basically just makes an arbitrary bet with Satan to see, all right, Satan, I'm going to let you torture Job as much as you want. We'll just see what he does. And by the way, if that's all you get out of the story of Job, go read Job. Because there's a lot more, there's a much more important message that is going on here in this book. But the idea is that when God finally answers Job, in Job 38, he gives him an answer that if I'm Job, I'm going to struggle with a little bit. Because his answer is not, well, Job, look, I know that you're hurting. It's okay. But there's a reason why I did this, and you're going to appreciate it, and it'll all work out well in the end. That's not what he says. Job 40, verse 8 says, 38, verse 4, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. In other words, Job, who are you to tell me how to run my universe? The one that I created. Now, that is a very unsatisfactory answer to me if I don't believe that God actually did create the universe and that God actually is sovereign. Down in chapter 40, later on, in verse 8, God tells Job, will you even put me in the wrong? Will you condemn me that you may be in the right? Have you an arm like God, and can you thunder with a voice like his? Adorn yourself with majesty and dignity. Clothe yourself with glory and splendor. Pour out the overflowing of your anger, and look on everyone who is proud and abase him. Look on everyone who is proud and bring him low, and tread down the wicked where they stand. Hide them all in the dust together. Bind their faces in the world below. And then will I also acknowledge to you that your own right hand can save. God basically saying, Job, look, you explain to me how you run things. How you make sure that everybody gets exactly what they deserve. And that every wrong is punished, and every right is rewarded, and everything is done completely equitably, and everything is fair and balanced. You tell me how that works, and then we'll have a discussion. That's a hard thing sometimes. It's kind of like a parent who said, look, do you run this household? Then you're going to do what I say. No kid ever wants to do that. But it's true. And sometimes it's an appropriate response. And you don't always like to give it as parents, but sometimes you just have to do that. And sometimes that's how God speaks to us. There's a reason why the Bible says that God resists the proud and gives grace to the humble. Because unless I'm willing to humble myself before God and see myself the way that God sees me, then there's no answer that God can give me that's going to be satisfactory. I'm never going to be satisfied with God's any explanation that God wants to give me about pain and suffering and judgment in this life. It's just, I'm not going to care. But if we're going to answer these questions in a fair way, we have to allow the Bible to define God for us, to show us all of God's characteristics, all of who God is, all of his nature, his full power, and all of the implications behind that. Atheists will go to the Bible oftentimes and will hone in on a verse or two or a passage here or a passage there, and they'll make judgments about God's character without looking at the full scope of who God is. That's never a reasonable critique. Doyle Moyer made this argument one time that I thought was really good. And he said, if this actually was a fictional book as you described it, and you wanted to go in, you were going to do a character analysis on this one man or this woman or whoever in this story, and you go pick out one chapter where he does something, and you're gonna base your entire understanding of that person on that one section and that one concept, would that really be an accurate description? He said, well, no, it wouldn't. Well, the same is true with God. I have to take everything that the Bible says about God and use that to understand why God does what he does and why God says what he says and whether God has the right to do any of that. So when the atheist says that your God is genocidal, he ordered the entire city of people to be wiped out. We can't simply stand in judgment on that action without understanding why all this happened. What was his relationship with those people? Why did he act this way? What led to those actions? Which means I have to evaluate it in light of the full story of who God is. And when we see God described in the Bible, as we kind of alluded to earlier, he is described as the eternal God, whose wisdom and understanding far surpasses our own. He created the world and all that's in it. I can't judge God based on what he does in the Bible without acknowledging, first of all, that God knows a lot more than I do. and understands a lot more deeply than I do. He created this world, secondly, with a purpose. Thirdly, he created it not to be a curse, but to be a blessing on mankind. He put man on this earth so he could do good to man. It was supposed to be a good thing. And showing God and showing man the best way to live life, the things that are truly good. And the only way to do that, he says, the only way to live a good life on this earth that I have created is to pursue righteousness and to look to serve God. And ultimately, that when I want to understand what is good and what is just, I need to be looking at God. And understanding that a God who sees far more than I can ever see needs to be my model for goodness. When God comes down to visit with Abraham in Genesis chapter 18, he tells him about his plans to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham intercedes on behalf of the city, if you remember. And he asks the question in Genesis 18:25, shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? Abraham had faith, knowing who God was, that ultimately God is going to make the right decision. And he kind of bargains with God. Remember, would you destroy the city for 50 righteous people? And of course, God, kind of keeps going down the number, and Abraham kind of whittles it down to 10 righteous people. And God says, fine, I won't destroy the city for the sake of 10 righteous people. And Abraham accepts that. He doesn't keep going down saying, look, God, ultimately, you really don't have the right to destroy any of these people. That's not what he says. Because he understands at the end of the day that God is righteous in punishing those who are wicked. He says that if God did destroy the city, it would be a just act, because it is God who's doing it. That's what faith looks like. Because the Bible makes the argument, first and foremost, that God is creator, he is Lord, and this world is his to do with as he sees fit. He claims for himself the power of life and death because he is the source of that life. Deuteronomy 32:39. See now that I, even I am he, there is no God beside me. I kill and I make alive. I wound and I heal, and there is none that can deliver out of my hand. Richard Dawkins can talk about whether that's megalomaniacal or not, but is it true? Because if it's true, we have to take that into account, don't we? Isaiah 40, verse 28. Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He understands a lot more about this world than we do. Down in Isaiah 29, I learned and I just registered to me in doing this lesson that if you want to understand the eternal nature of God and his righteousness, Isaiah is a book you need to study. Because Isaiah has a lot to say about that concept. He says in verse 15 of Isaiah 29, you who hide deep from the Lord your counsel, whose deeds are in the dark, and who say, who sees us, who knows us? You turn things upside down. Shall the potter be regarded as the clay, that the thing made should say of its maker, he did not make me? Or the thing formed say to him who is formed, he has no understanding. God is the creator. He knows fully more than we know ourselves. He is able to see the world in a context which we can never see it, and is without our limited understanding and experience, he's able to see far more than we can see. And with that understanding, we have to acknowledge that if God created this world and everything in it, he has authority over it, and he understands what is right and what is wrong. He sees the hearts of men, and he has the right to expect that it conform to his purpose as the one who created it. We all recognize that, right? If we create something, it's ours. I go back into my garage and I build a robot, I get to do whatever I want with it. Well, I can't. Not to kill people or anything like that. I can't violate the law. But in terms of what I want to do in my own home, I can do whatever I want with that because it's mine. And I get to decide whether it's really functioning the way it's supposed to work. I mean, it might do certain things really, really well, and somebody might come and say, well, that's a really good robot. No, it's not. Because I wanted it to do this, and it's not doing that. In fact, when I tell it to do that, it does the exact opposite. That's not going to work. And I have the right, as the creator of that robot, I can scrap it and start all over if I want. I can do whatever I want to do because it's mine. Because when I create something, I have power and authority over it. We all understand that. There's an irony in that many who would call God a murderer would have no problem ending the life of a child in the womb because the mother created it. It's her body, therefore that's her child, and it's her right to end that pregnancy however he sees fit. There's no problem with that. But God, if God's to end his creation, well, God's murderer. You see the inconsistency there? Because we don't have objective truth, right? If there is no God, there's no objective truth, and whatever I decide is good is whatever is good. Now, we don't agree with the logic, obviously, of the abortions provided. But if it's true, how much more is it true of God, who upholds the universe, as we said in Hebrews 1:3, with the power of his word? Our very existence is dependent on God's willingness to allow us to continue. We have life because God gives it to us according to his will. Now, does that God have the right to judge the world? To evaluate whether those in the world should live or die? That sounds harsh, doesn't it? We might not like that choice, but it's hard to argue that the God that we read about in the Bible wouldn't have every right to do whatever he chooses to do, and that his choice would be based on much greater knowledge than what we possess, and his choice has to be fair, and it has to be just, because he's the one that determines all of those things. This is God who ultimately knows the hearts and minds of his creation better than they know themselves, who exists, as we talked about this morning, in eternity outside of time. Isaiah 46:9 says, "Remember the former things of old, for I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand and I will accomplish all my purpose." Isaiah 57:15. "For thus says the one who is high and lifted up, who inhabits eternity, whose name is holy." Would that God not be capable of a greater justice than ours? Proverbs 15:11, "Sheol and Abaddon lie open before the Lord. How much more the hearts of the children of Israel?" The Bible shows us a God who is powerful and wise, capable of perfect justice. And the first problem we face is when we start with the assumption that not only can we define what is fair and just for God, but that we can stand justified before God. I don't deserve the judgment of God. These people are in the world who don't deserve the judgment of God. None of us. We're all doing fine without God. What does the Bible tell us? All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Because, as we said earlier, God created man and he created him with a purpose. Micah 6:8 tells us, "He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly before your God?" Does God have the right to judge me for not doing what he tells me to do? Well, what if I don't want to live that way? What right does God have to tell me how to live? Or what kind of person I ought to be? The answer is pretty simple. Because he created me. He has that right. He's the master. But here's where we get to the important part. Because despite all of that, God doesn't force you to live the way he created you. Because God has also given us free will to choose what path I'm going to take. Will I model myself after the righteousness of God? Or will I establish my own standard of righteousness? The story of the Bible, in large part, is about man choosing his path. Continually going the other way, selecting my will over the will of the one who created me. This is Ecclesiastes 7:29. "God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes." God allows us to make that choice, though, because to do anything else would be unfair. God would be simply creating a mindless group of puppets going through the motions of life. That's kind of what Calvinists say is happening. God just created man, and he tells us everything to do, and we just kind of go around, walking around, following whatever script God has written for us, and so we don't really choose to do anything, and God then turns around and judges us based on the things that we were forced to do to begin with. If you don't believe in Calvinism, does anybody believe that's fair? Of course not. We want to make our own choices. And God says, okay, I'm going to allow you to decide for yourself. And the same thing's true for God. R.C. Sproul, who is a Calvinist, he's one of the prominent Calvinist writers out there, wrote one time that God is never obligated to be merciful. Mercy and grace must be voluntary, or they are no longer mercy and grace. God never owes grace. Isn't that true? Would we agree with that? I think that's absolutely right. Isn't the same thing true for love? Is love really love if I'm compelled to love? If I don't have any choice? If it's something that doesn't come from myself, love has to be voluntary, or is it love? And God's desire more than anything is that his creation love him. and appreciate what He has done. That's why the greatest command, Deuteronomy 6:5, that Jesus cites is, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and with all your mind. He doesn't say the greatest command is do everything God tells you to do. He says love the Lord. Now, we can have a whole other lesson about what that means and the fact that if I love God, I'm going to do what He says. But God doesn't want us to do it because we're compelled to, or because we don't have any choice in the matter. God wants us to look at God and His justice and His mercy and His righteousness and say His way is right and the world's way is wrong. I'm going to follow God. That's the goal. So why is this so important? Why is love so important? Because when someone loves us, it's, the world thinks about this. This goes back to Richard Dawkins' idea. God just wants people to love Him the reason that I want people to most. Because it validates me. It makes me feel warm inside. And it hurts my feelings when people don't love me. And, that time when you ask somebody out, they say no, and you get mad, and now you hate them because they didn't do what you want. That's how we think about this idea, isn't it? They make serving God about God's own need to be acknowledged and loved. Which, by the way, goes back to what we were talking about with the Greek idea of gods. Why do we worship gods? Because if we don't worship gods, the gods just kind of disappear. That's the worldly way of looking at God. But that's not why God calls us to love Him. God calls us to love us because when we love God, we do so as a response to all that God has done for us. We do it because we are grateful to God. And we recognize the grace that is in God and the goodness that is in God. And we aspire to be like Him. We aspire to conform ourselves to His will. In John 5, Jesus is talking to the Pharisees of that day. And in verse 39, He tells them, you search the Scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life, and it is they that bear witness about me. Yet you refuse to come to me that you may have life. I do not receive glory from people, but I know that you do not have the love of God within you. I have come in my Father's name, and you do not receive me. If another come in his own name, you will receive him. How can you believe when you receive glory from one another and do not seek the glory that comes from the only God? What does true love for God do? It compels me to listen to Him, to accept His will, to obey Him. And if I don't love God, I'm not going to listen to God, and I don't want to do what He tells me to do, and what's going to happen then? Well, I'm going to be lost. A lack of love for God, a lack of appreciation for all God has done is the root of every rebellion that mankind has ever instigated ever. But I have to choose to love God. I can't have God choose it for me. But when I do that, when I have that ability to choose, that also means I get to choose evil, doesn't it? I can choose to love God or I can choose to love the world. And in doing so, I go against the purpose for which I've been created. But I do more than that. When we think about what sin is, we often think about it from very worldly terms, don't we? Sin's violating the law. I broke the rule. Big deal. Who hasn't broken a rule? Who hasn't run a stop sign? Nobody died. Everybody was fine. I looked both ways. Nobody was here. And I ran the stoplight. Big deal. Isn't that kind of how we... So why is God so concerned about me breaking a rule here and there? Why can't He just ignore it and move on and live the way and let me live the way I want to live? And the answer to that is that we don't understand the true nature of sin, because sin is a rebellion against the nature of God. When I sin, what do? I reject God's plan of righteousness for me, and I say, I want to live by my own standard, and I don't respect the standard that you have set for me. And in doing so, by definition, I argue that God is not righteous. Maybe I don't think about it in those terms. But God does not know what's best for me. He didn't know what was best for me in that situation, and so I chose to do something that was contrary to God's law, and I feel like I made the right decision. Isn't that kind of how we justify ourselves? The best way that we can understand this, I think, and to really appreciate what it means to sin against God, is how John explains the concept of light and darkness. I'm a big fan of this concept, as Laura will attest, because I talk about it a lot. But I don't know of a better way to understand why God can't just simply say, they sinned, no big deal, and move on. In John 1:4-5, it says, in Him was life, and life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Now, in 1 John, there's a very similar parallel statement in 1 John chapter 1, verse 5, where he tells the people there, This is the message we have heard from him and proclaimed to you, that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. If we say we have fellowship with him while we walk in darkness, we lie and do not practice the truth. But if we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship one with another, and the blood of Jesus, his Son, cleanses us from all sin. And this is a great way to understand good and evil in terms of the Bible. Because people will make that argument. Well, if God created everything, didn't God create evil too? That's the gotcha moment, right? We've got the Christian now. If he created everything, that means he created evil too. Doesn't that mean that God can't truly be good? And then he allows that evil to continue on, which means he's responsible for that evil. Why doesn't God simply remove evil from the world? As if evil is some created thing. But when we think about evil in terms of light and darkness, what do we see? Evil is not a created thing, even more than darkness is a created thing. And darkness is simply the absence of light. Darkness isn't anything. It was the constant state. You know, why did darkness go away? When God said, "Let there be light." And God introduced light into the world. That's when darkness became defined. It had no definition before that. It has now become the absence of light. Sin, or evil, is defined as being that which is opposed to God's righteousness. It isn't invented, it simply is. And it can't exist apart from God. There is no evil if there is no God, because there's nothing by which to define evil. God did not create sin. God did not create evil. And until man first sinned, sin and evil were not in the world. At least not in the physical sense. We see Satan depicted in the Garden of Eden, and someone might argue, well, God created Satan. He sure did. And I don't know that I understand all the details of that story, but what I do know is that Satan clearly had the ability to choose, just like I do. And he made a choice to choose evil rather than good. He chose to rebel against God. That was his choice. And so when we think about this idea of sin and righteousness, and think about it in terms of light and darkness, you start to understand a fundamental truth of the Bible, that they cannot coexist. I can't bring darkness into light. It's dispelled. It can't live. It can't survive. That's the point that the Old Testament tries to show us so often, that when I want to come into the presence of God, if there's sin in my life, I can't do it. Because it is not compatible with the presence of God. I don't think we understand that sometimes. I don't think we appreciate that. At least people in the world who have maybe a superficial understanding of God. Why can't I just live however I want to live? Why can't I just do what I want to do, and God will just accept me from that standpoint? Well, I don't know. Why is it that I can't keep this corner of the world dark when I shine a flashlight on it? Because it's impossible. In Exodus chapter 33, do you remember when Moses is pleading with the Lord to stay with Israel? And he asked God, show me your glory. I want to see for my own eyes the greatness that is God. And God tells him in verse 19, I will make all my goodness pass before you. I will proclaim before you my name, the Lord, and I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious. I will show mercy on whom I will show mercy. But he says, you cannot see my face, for man shall not see me and live. In fact, one of the great acts of grace we see in the Old Testament is when man is brought into the presence of God and man's life is spared. Isn't that what Isaiah says? When Isaiah is shown the throne room of God, he comes into the presence of God. In Isaiah 6:5, he says, woe is me, for I am lost. I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. I can't even imagine what that must have been like for him. But I do know one thing, that the first thing he thought of is, I don't belong here. Because I have sinned in my life. I have rejected this, the God of glory. I have turned my back on him because I have sinned and I am not worthy to be there. And why doesn't God just wipe me off the face of the earth right now? Sin is a huge deal. Every single sin. There's none of them, even the ones that seem meaningless to me, there's none of them that don't matter because they separate us from God. And those things have to be dealt with. Well, that's not fair or whatever. The Bible says not only is it fair, it's just. It's right. A just creator who cannot abide unrighteousness, who is in fact just by nature, who cannot overlook sin. God's character itself demands that sin carry with it the penalty of death. The soul that sins, it will die. And so when the atheist goes to Noah's flood and says, well, what about all those people that weren't murdering and robbing and raping and doing all these horrible things? assuming that was true. It was pretty bad in the days of Noah. I don't know how bad it was. We oftentimes try to project ourselves back there and assume that their culture was just like ours, and surely it wasn't really that big of a deal. How it was? We're not told, other than the fact that God said that He looked at the wickedness of man, and He said that every intent and thought of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that He had even made man on the earth. It must have been pretty bad. We aren't told what that entailed. But this is not a picture of a bunch of happy, innocent people minding their own business and having a good life and everything's wonderful, and all of a sudden God says, no, that's sorry, we're done. But even if that had been the case, the question isn't were they being actively malevolent or inflicting harm on each other, which is typically our standard for good and evil today. Are they hurting anybody? Then what's the problem? Then it must be okay. The question is, were they in rebellion against God? And the answer is yes. And apparently to a degree that went far beyond just not honoring God. Whatever it was involved darkness and it was deserving of death. And there's this assumption, by the way, that goes with this story. The idea that, well, look, I'm just doing what I want to do. It's not hurting anybody. You ever heard anybody say that? With the full understanding that there's really no way that I can make that statement for sure. I don't know whether my actions are hurting. I just think, if I say I'm not hurting anybody, it's just because I don't know that I'm not hurting anybody. I just make that assumption. We assume that there's no negative consequences for sin against God in this life. That somehow, if God would just leave us alone and let us live the way we want to live, that everything would work out just fine. We assume that God doesn't see where that mindset always leads. Even when we don't see it in this particular moment. We assume that God's just putting up arbitrary barriers that are completely detached from our own well-being. What is Deuteronomy 10 when Moses gives them the law and reads to them the Ten Commandments? In Deuteronomy 10:12, what does he say? He tells them, and now Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all His ways, to love Him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the commandments and statutes of the Lord, which I am commanding you today for your good. If you live this way, things will go well with you. And if you don't live this way, it's going to go bad. Even when you don't see it at the time. Maybe at the time it seems like everything is going to be fine. There's this idea that when God puts prohibitions on my behavior, that it's punitive in nature somehow. God just doesn't want me to have any fun. He's just depriving me of something. And that's the story of Satan, isn't it? In the garden, what's the first thing he says? You're not going to die. God just knows that if you eat this, things will be so much better for you. And so why are you going to listen to Him? Isn't that the idea? When we don't trust God, when we don't see the wisdom of God, that somehow I can just do whatever I want to do, and God really didn't know what He was talking about. That there were no really bad consequences. Story after story in the Bible shows when one man sins, innocent people suffer. Always. But the story of David is such a great example of this. One sin, one indiscretion. And after all, I'm king. I can have anybody I want. It shouldn't be a big deal. I'll just go ahead and do it, and everything will be fine. How many hundreds and thousands of people died because of this? Because of one thing that David did. Is that fair? Not really. This person over here is innocent. They didn't do anything wrong. And yet all of a sudden David is having an affair with my wife. And he's trying to cover it up. And now he has to kill me to make that right. And all this thing happened. Uriah, an innocent man, is killed. And we think, how can that happen? There's a pretty easy answer to that. Sin happened. And sin caused me to violate God's law, and the result of that, there was pain and death and suffering. And we could have prevented all of this if we just said, you know what, maybe I'll listen to God. Because maybe God understands where sin will lead in my life. When God allows me to continue in their evil, and when that evil results in pain and suffering and the pain of others, what's our response to that? The atheist response is, how can God allow this? Our reaction ought to be, this is what happens when we allow the world to rule us. This is what happens when I let sin rule my life, rather than listening to God. If we truly understand that all these tragedies have been rooted in that basic question of sin, am I following God or am I following self? And that long ago mankind chose that second option. This is where man's way will always lead us. Pain, sorrow, and death. It's supposed to make us take sin seriously. It's supposed to make us turn to God As Jeremiah 10:23 says, I know, O Lord, that the way of man is not in himself, that it is not a man who walks to direct his own steps. Because I've seen how that works out. I've seen what happens. But instead what happens, we double down. We argue that the only reason that these things are happening to us is that we let the wrong people run the show. You ever heard that? Look, we could have a perfect utopian society in this world and everything would be wonderful and there would be no pain and suffering and everything would be great if we just put the right people in office. Smarter people, better people. And we keep chasing that dream of a paradise apart from God. The only paradise we will ever experience is found in the presence of God, where there is no sin, where there is no darkness. And because of our own free will that God has given us, we get to make a choice and say, I don't want what the world has to offer. I've seen where it leads, and it leads nowhere good. I want something better. I want something that God has promised. Does that help us to understand a little bit maybe the concept of hell? This is the hard one. How could God allow somebody to go to hell? How could God torment somebody for eternity? Maybe it's because we don't always describe hell the way we ought to describe it. And I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to speed up a little bit here. But when we think about what hell is, what's the image in our mind? The world thinks about hell as this big pit of fire, and there's Satan down there with his pitchfork, and he's torturing people and laughing about it and everything, and it's this idea of this eternal torment, and God's up here saying, you should have listened to me, and now you're just going to suffer for eternity. And don't you wish you could be up here? That's kind of the image. And Jesus describes hell, when he talks about it, the common theme that comes out in his discussions is the concept of outer darkness. Eternal punishment away from the presence of the Lord. And when we think about what we talked about with free will, what is it? It's me making a choice. Where do I want to be? Who do I want to live with? Who do I want to follow? And when somebody says, I've actually heard people make this argument, well, why won't God let me into heaven just because I don't believe it? Why won't God let me into heaven just because I don't want to do what he says? He should let me come in anyway because I want heaven. That would be great. Is that somehow this choice hadn't already been made that I don't have any interest in being with God. I don't have any interest in God's righteousness. I've already said I don't want the light. I don't want to serve God. And what God has said over and over again is he is not going to force anybody to spend eternity with him that does not want to be there. That does not value the light rather than the darkness. And I think sometimes we describe hell as if it's this idea of torture and fire. And well, is that a literal thing? I don't know. What I do know is this. That hell is described ultimately in the worst possible terms. Because that's the only way we can understand what it really means to fully be cut off from God. To fully not realize all the things that God blesses us with. It's a little sad, I think, when we see the kind of depression, discontent, and disillusionment that seems to have set in with so many people today who are trying to build their lives apart from God. And the atheist jumps in and says, well, no, you're wrong. We're all happy. Everything's wonderful. I'm having a wonderful life without God. But that life is wonderful because you're still enjoying the blessings of God. Even when you don't acknowledge that. Even when you don't believe they're from God. And what does Matthew 5 talk about? The idea that God blesses the just and the unjust. Jesus doesn't say that God sends good things to this earth so that people will love him and benefit from him. But the people who hate him, well, they're not going to get anything. God says, I'm going to bless all of you. Living on this earth. Whether you love God or hate God, you can enjoy life. What happens when I cut myself off from that? When I say, I don't want to be with God. And even the blessings that God is giving me now in this life are taken away. That's what hell's going to be. Can you imagine that? I don't want to imagine that. Somebody made the point. God is so willing to bless the people that are bad. The real question should be not why God makes good people suffer or allows good people to suffer. The real question is, why does God continue to bless bad people? Why does God continue to give all these wonderful things in this life to people who hate him? To people who have rejected him? Why does God allow me to keep living my life in violation of his will? Refusing to fulfill my creative purpose. Why did God just simply strike me down right now? Because I think sometimes we talk about the justice of God and we look at the Old Testament. Look what God did. One guy just touched an ark and God just put him to death. How is that? And we think about that and we ignore the literally millions of times that didn't happen. The times that people sinned and violated God's law and they didn't die. They just kept on living. The story of Ahab is amazing to me. Ahab he reigned for 20-something years, I forget off the top of my head, the worst king in the history of Israel, and yet God just keeps letting him go. Keeps allowing him to win battles. In fact, he sends prophets to him saying, hey, Ahab, the Syrians are going to come here and attack you. This is what you need to do to defeat them. He keeps doing good things for him despite all of that. Why does God keep doing that? And the answer is that God does not want for us to be separated from him. We can't judge God on the basis of his willingness to exact justice without also accepting his numerous and baffling attempts to extend mercy to people who don't want mercy. Because we talked about earlier, mercy isn't mercy if it's an obligation. God doesn't have to do anything for us, and yet he does. And the choice ultimately is ours. Do I believe that God is who he claims to be? Do I trust that everything in this life, every pain, every loss, every difficulty, is there for one purpose, and that is to call me to my Creator? A Creator who didn't just put me on this earth and wash his hands and say, all right, I'm done, you just make the best of it as he can. But that he loved me enough to do the unthinkable, that none of us would have ever done for anybody else. He sent his only begotten Son. Romans 5:8-9 says, but God shows his love for us, and that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Since therefore we have now been justified by his blood, much more shall we be saved by him from the wrath of God. I think that's, I changed my slides a little bit, and I can't see the future ones, so I can't remember. When we talk about the wrath of God, we're not talking about God throwing a fit because he didn't get his way. We're talking about the righteous response to an act of rebellion. My rebellion. And yet God says, I'm going to save you from my own wrath by paying the cost for you, by sending Jesus, who is our peace offering. This isn't the Jesus of the atheist man who's knocking on my door saying, hey, I want you to let me save you from the bad things I'm going to do for you if you don't do what I tell you to do. That's how the atheist represents that. What a shallow and ignorant way to describe the story of the gospel of Jesus Christ. The better way is in Ephesians 2, verse 4, where it says, God, being rich in mercy because of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved, and raised us with him and seated us with him in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus, so that in the coming age he might show the immeasurable riches of his grace and kindness towards us in Christ Jesus. God, who had to do nothing for me, did everything for me. And the heart that seeks God, seeks that offer of salvation, reads this and says, what a great and gracious God we serve, who would do this for someone like me. Is that how we see God? That goes a long way to answering that question. Why does God allow sin? Why does God allow evil? Why does God punish those who sin against him? Because he's God. And why does he call me back into fellowship with him despite all that I've done in my life? Because that's who God is. And he offers that for us every day. And if you have that need tonight, we want to help you with that, to make your life right with God. As I said, we can rage day and night about how God is unfair and unjust, and why he tells us I have to do this, why he tells us I shouldn't be able to do that. But at the end of the day, he's my Creator. And I owe him my life, and I owe him my allegiance, and I owe him my love. We can help you to do that. Please let us know as we stand, as we let our invitation song.